How can you attack right in an opening stage? Well, in most of the cases, the main task for an opening is to develop your pieces. Sometimes you can go for an attack right away. For example, let's take a look at this position from the game between two master level players. It is white to play now. You may notice one thing here. Black delayed development of his king side pieces, and therefore his king is still in the center of the board. Whenever you notice this kind of a pattern, when opponent's king is in the center, it always makes sense for you to try to find a way to start an attack, especially if you're ahead in development. But how can you do it practically? If white tries to attack in the most immediate, the most obvious way by playing bishop to a3, attacking that pawn on d6, black can cover it really easily by playing pawn to c5, and it kind of failed. It doesn't really bring anything to white. What should white do instead? On one hand, it seems like everything is in the white's favor. He's ahead in development, the black's king is in the center, and everything looks good, but how can you start attacking? The first rule suggests here that you need to open up the position, especially in the center, because that's the only way how you can start attacking directly. Otherwise, as you may notice, the black's king is protected by a lot of the pawns that stand in front of him, and therefore both, by the way, black's pawns and white's pawns, and therefore it prevents white's pieces from going against the king, from going after the king. That's why the first thing to do is to clear the roadblocks, which you can do by pushing your pawns forward and opening more lines. In the game, white played pawn to f4, which does make sense in light of what we have just said, but even better was to play pawn to d4, because we mainly want to open the position in the center. It is a pawn sacrifice, but it is well worth it. In case black captures the pawn, white should continue this strategy of opening more and more lines by playing pawn to e5. And now you can already notice that white's pieces start taking aim at black's king. And if black takes that pawn, what else can he do? White can already take one of his pawns back by playing queen takes d4. It is not a queen sacrifice because the black's pawn is under the spin. He can't capture the white's queen, and therefore you may notice that black is already somewhat in trouble. White is threatening knight d6 check, which would also attack then not only the king but that pawn on f7. Simultaneously, white even wants to simply take back that pawn on e5, which would open up the e-file to fire against the black's king. And black is just losing. As you can see, white managed to obtain a winning position so easily within just two pawn moves, which would open up the position. For example, if black tries knight e7 to cover his king somehow, white can continue with knight to d6 check to make sure that the king has to move and has to stay in the center. You certainly don't want the king to escape by castling, so we'll play knight d6 check, and after the king goes to f8, white can just remove his queen from the attack by playing queen c4, and now the f7 square is attacked by three of the white's pieces, by both of the knights and the queen, and therefore inevitably it's going to be captured on the next move, and either black's king will be checkmated or white will gain significant material advantage. That's why that was the way for white to win the game, just by opening up the position. A few key takeaways: whenever you notice that opponent's king got delayed with castling, you should always look for ways to attack, and the way to do it is to open up a position, mainly by playing pawn moves in the center. Here's another game between Donev and Mihailsen. Again, both master level players. It is white to play, and the position looks quite standard, and black only needs to castle his king, and the position would be just about equal normal middle game position. But it is white to play, and he decided to take his chance and try attacking the centralized king. In order to begin the attack, as we already know, you need to open up the lines first. You need to open up the lines in the center, and that is why white played pawn to f5. It is a sacrifice of the pawn because black can take the pawn, which he did. He took the pawn, firstly with a pawn, then with a knight, and after this exchange it seems like black just won the pawn for nothing. Was it that white miscalculated something? No, he had an idea in mind. He had the idea to open up lines. And now he can take advantage of this situation by playing rook e1 check, which certainly would be impossible in the future because of a lot of pawns in the center, but now he can start changing the king. Let me also highlight that it is an intuitive sacrifice. There is no way for white to calculate all the consequences till the end, but you usually can be sure that these kind of sacrifices are all right for one major reason. Whenever you can force your opponent to leave his king in the center, that would force your opponent to play somewhat without the rook. Because without costing, it's extremely difficult to bring the rook into play. And therefore, if you force this kind of situation, your opponent will be unable to use the rook in the game. That's why it does make sense to sacrifice a pawn, sometimes even a piece, because you somewhat deactivate opponent's rook at the same time. Anyway, let's see what happened next. Black covered his king by playing bishop e6. White continued attacking. Of course, after sacrificing, we want to go forward and attack. This is what we already discussed in the previous lesson. You want to go to opponent's half of the board and attack something. White played knight g5, taking aim at the bishop, and also to discover the attack of the knight. Black played knight e5 to further close the e-file. So white traded off the minor pieces there, and here he made another intuitive sacrifice. He played rook takes e5, and the point of this move is once again to try by all means to force the black's king to stay in the center. White wants to deliver that check bishop c6, but currently this square is under the control of the knight, and therefore white is willing to eliminate the knight even at the cost of the rook, because on the next move it helps him to play bishop c6 check, forcing the king to stay in the center. Again, I don't analyze all the lines here, there are multiple options, but you can notice the general pattern of how things continue here. Black played king f8, white played queen f3 check, black played queen f6, and here comes queen e4. It's interesting that there is no straightforward attack against the black's king, but nevertheless there are a lot of threats that white may execute in the nearest future. Like white can play bishop e3, attacking that pawn on c5. Also the white's rook is ready to go either to f1 in the future or somewhere across the board to a7, and all in all that there are a lot of different attacking ideas that white may execute. Black played king g8, and this is exactly what we talked about. Even though black managed to bring his king to a more safe place, but at the same time the rook on h8 is currently totally locked, and therefore even though black has material advantage overall, but if you assume that this rook is out of game, and if we just calculate the pieces that are active in reality, then we would assume that white is even somewhat has an extra piece in the game, because both players has a queen and a rook in the game, but also white has two bishops in the game versus black's single bishop. Therefore, it's almost like white has an extra piece in reality. Alright, let's see what happened next. White played bishop e3, attacking that pawn on c5. Black protected it by playing queen e7. White played rook a5 to attack it once again. Now there is already no way for black to protect it, so he tried h5. He tries somehow to activate his rook and maybe even bring his king to h7. Anyway, white firstly collects the pawn, queen goes back to d8, attacking the rook, so the rook goes forward, rook a7, and black played king h7. For a moment it may seem like black somewhat finally brought his king to safety, but it's only an illusion of safety, because white can continue queen takes e5 using the pin, and it's fairly obvious that white's attack is extremely strong. In fact, here black played rook g8, and at this point white could just win the game right away by playing bishop to d4, simply reinforcing the attack of this g7 bishop. Notice that it is pinned, therefore the bishop cannot go away, it has to cover the king, and right now white just wants to grab the bishop with the rook and win the game. If black tries playing queen f8 to protect the bishop, then white can also play bishop e4, bringing the bishop into play, and now he is threatening to take queen takes h5, using the fact that the pawn on g6 is under the pin. And even if black moves the king away, white can still grab the pawn, and black can't take the queen. Well, frankly, he's defenseless anyway, but if he takes the queen, white delivers this rook h7 checkmate. Pretty cool game with a lot of interesting variations and sacrifices, and here you may notice this one general pattern. Let me just show you the position that occurred in this game a couple moves ago. The general pattern that if you are able to keep your opponent's king in the center, it would simultaneously force him to almost play without a rook, and that is why it's a very powerful thing for you to do, which you can achieve by playing pawn moves in the center to open up the position and start attacking opponent's king directly. Here's one more example between Dussel and Huget. Not sure how to pronounce the names properly. Anyway, it is white to play. And the one thing you may notice here is that firstly, the black skin is in the center. Secondly, white is ahead in development. White has already developed all of his minor pieces and castled, while for black there's a lot of work needs to be done there to finalize his development. At the same time, white needs to hurry up, because black only need to play bishop to e7 and then castle his king, and he will be just alright. That's why white desperately need to open up the lines in the center as soon as possible. And with that in mind, he plays bishop to d5. He's inviting black to grab that bishop because it would help white to open the e-file and start attacking black's king. Now black is already somewhat in trouble. If he plays bishop e7 trying to cover the king in the most natural way, white plays knight f5 and he takes this bishop back right on the next move. There is just no way for black to protect it. If black instead plays his king to d7, then black saves an extra piece, but at the cost of leaving his king exposed and extremely vulnerable in the center of the board. White can continue by playing pawn to b4, taking the knight, because it really has not many squares to go to. It only can go to a4, which would help white to break black's pawn structure. And at this point, there are different things white can do. For example, he can even make sort of positional move, pawn to c4, protecting his center, and at the same time preparing queen takes a4, which would continue attacking black's king and also collect the pawn on a4. Therefore, everything seems to be just extremely great for white. Let's see what else black can do here. In the actual game, after white played bishop d5, black decided to avoid opening up the lines and he played queen to c7. However, now white can continue his attack with no sacrifices. He simply first of all took that knight on f6 because it helps him to break the pawn structure, and then he continued queen to f3, attacking that pawn on f6. Black played bishop g7, and here white continues to attack. He plays pawn to b4. Notice that white tries to attack by his every move, and that's another great strategy and another common theme for almost all the attacking kind of positions, because you need to attack as quickly as possible. You need to launch your attack as soon as you can, because you leave no time for your opponent to bring up reserves, for instance the rooks, or to hide his king. Black played knight a4, and here white used a little combination, knight takes b5. It's not truly a sacrifice because white can collect the material back within the next move, and therefore after black recaptures and black plays queen to b6 because queen was attacked, white can play bishop takes b7. And that's the point of the white's combination. The bishop may not be taken. In this case, white would go knight takes d6 with a double attack to black's king and queen. In this case, white would win the material thanks to this fork, and therefore black may not take the bishop, which just helped white to win 2 pawns for nothing. Black played rook to b8. And here white made another cool move. He continued his strategy of playing in the center, opening up the lines. He played pawn to e5. And that's another cool thing. White somewhat reduced the threat of knight takes d6 and also prepares possibly some check on c6, which would happen in case black grabs the knight, for instance. In this case, bishop c6 wins the queen. Even though it may seem like sudden tactics, but in reality it's not, because It follows the white strategy to keep the black's king in the center, to open up the lines in the center, and to start an attack. And this is exactly what he's doing with his every move. Black decided to take that pawn on e5, but now white can play bishop c6, forcing the king to move. King goes to e7, and again, at the moment it may seem like the black's king is covered very nicely by his pawns, but that's what we know we should destroy. Whenever you want to attack opponent's king, you need to remove this pawn shield around the king, and you can do this usually by playing pawn moves, which would trade off the pawns, and sometimes with the help of a sacrifice. Like in this case, he played knight takes d6, sacrificing the knight but inviting black's king for a very dangerous walk. Black takes, white plays rook d1. Once again, after opening the lines, white may start attacking the king directly. Black played king c7, and after queen f7 he resigned, because after king takes c6 or king c8, white plays just queen d7, checkmate. Very cool game where white illustrated all the main rules of attack in the opening, which is, first of all, you need to notice when your opponent delayed his development a little bit, when his king is still in the center. In this case, you need to try to open up the position, which you can do with the help of pawn moves or sometimes sacrifices. And lastly, you need to try to attack as soon as possible and as quickly as possible, because this does not leave your opponent with any free time to bring up his rook from h8, or sometimes his queenside rook as well, to help his king. And that's how you can help yourself to have more pieces in the attack than the defenders that your opponent can use. That's been the lesson about launching your attack in the early stage of the game in an opening. I hope it helps, and I'll talk to you in the next lesson where we'll talk about attacking the king which has already castled.